All right, Marjaan, thank you so much for meeting with me this morning. I'm really appreciative of our chance to speak.
Thank you for having me.
So today, and I should let you know, we are live on Facebook and you're all tagged in that.
Okay, sweet.
This morning, we're talking about a number of things, but first we can just start with a quick introduction. I'll introduce this new series, and then you can introduce yourself. I want to apologize in advance for any technology issues. This is our first time doing this type of video on Facebook Live using a mixture of Zoom and Facebook. So please let us know in the comments if any tech issues come up. We can always do better every time. My name is Serene Saadeh, and I am the Executive Director of the UpTake, which is a community news organization in the Twin Cities. And we have been spending a lot of time talking about the killing of George Floyd and the movements around police abolition and the need to recenter Black voices and Black narratives in that work around police abolition in Minneapolis, St. Paul. This series is the first in a series, and it will be happening every other Friday around 11 a.m. as we talk with community leaders and community organizers and electeds around what it means to abolish the police, what it means to recenter Black narratives and Black lives in our organizing and in our communities, and what that organizing actually looks like on the ground. With me today is Marjaan, who is a columnist for the UpTake, a new writer for us, and we're so glad to have him, and a longtime South Minneapolis community organizer who's going to be talking about the organizing happening around police abolition and just abolition in general in the 30th Street community. Marjaan, welcome.
Thank you again. Thanks for having me, and I'm excited for this conversation. And I actually have a new piece that I'm working on about abolition as well.
So how did you become involved in this conversation?
Well, I would say it's rooted in my experience growing up here in the Twin Cities as a Black youth growing up in the suburbs, dealing with violent white supremacy and policing, and the politics around abolition in the Black community are more common than the actual labels and terms of abolition. So, Black folks have known forever that the police function in society is, not to uphold public safety, but to uphold order, especially in poor communities. And I remember, I think I was about 12 years old when I watched Rodney King get nearly beat to death by the LAPD. And that was, around the same time when my experiences with the police began to change. As a child, I remember police in our suburban communities. I grew up in low-income housing with a single mother, around other poor folks. It was a pretty multiracial community surrounded by very white, affluent families. And I remember the police engaging with us as children, handing out football cards, playing football with us. And, it really fell into that narrative of them being the good guys and the heroes. And, I can remember that as early as maybe 6, 7 years old. And, by the time I got to 9, 10 years old, not only did the police start to treat us differently, but also the parents of our white friends began to treat us differently as well. And then as a teenager, growing up in Bloomington, I've had some pretty awful experiences with the police. I was assaulted when I was 17 years old. I was a senior in high school at Kennedy High, and I was, on my way back to class after having lunch. We had open campus lunch, and I was crossing the street, and I was detained by an undercover police officer for jaywalking. and I was uncooperative. I was upset. I was 17. I was late for class, and he called for backup, and took about 4 of them to really manhandle me and pummel me and brutalize me, just to detain me for jaywalking. And they took me to the city jail, and I missed class, and they never charged me with anything. But that was my first very violent encounter with the police, but it definitely wasn't my last. So really my activism, it's rooted in my experience. But in this community, we've been doing a lot of work around combating gentrification and policing in different ways. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But this conversation, it's also much bigger than policing as well. So I've come into this conversation in many different ways. As a teacher, I taught for 2 years in Minneapolis Public Schools with the Office of Black Male Student Achievement. Michael Walker is the director. They're doing great work still with the young kings and queens. So as a teacher, abolition was always front and center in the classroom, whether we're talking about on the plantation or off the plantation. So it's always, to me, about centering modern day abolition in a historical context.
And you were a social studies teacher with MPS, is that right? And you taught at North High at one point?
Yeah, I worked particularly with the Office of Black Male Student Achievement. So our role was a little different than just a traditional MPS teacher, but my licensure is under social studies, and I was specifically a Black history teacher. So I worked with all Black boys. So I taught a semester at North, a semester at Field Middle School. I taught 2 years at Franklin Middle School. That was where I did the majority of my work. And I taught a year at Fair High School downtown, and we also did pull-out groups with younger kids. And so the majority of my students were North Side, Black boys from the North Side, but I also did work with a group of South Side boys. Some of my students are actually neighbors. I had one of my students' moms in my block meeting yesterday. So these conversations are, whether they're in the classroom on the North Side or in the classroom on the South Side, they're rooted in the community. And our goal has been really trying to, the goal of, I should say, the Office of Black Male Student Achievement, one of the goals is to bring those voices from Black youth in the conversations that are happening in Black households, to the forefront and create space for that. And these are a lot of, conversations that are happening in Black communities. Again, a lot of folks don't necessarily use the term abolition, but the politic around a world free of, being murdered by the state, Black folks get that. And especially when we start to connect, policing enforcement to racial poverty. And, in this community, this is all tied to the battle for land. And I'll, again, I want to make more of those connections as we talk further.
So what does abolition mean to you? I know you've said that it's bigger than just police abolition. So what does that mean to you? And how is that connected to your work in South Minneapolis at 38th Street?
So the work we've been doing, the work I've been doing, particularly in this community, I've lived here in the Bryant neighborhood for 13 years. And so Bryant, most people would probably just refer to it as Central. If you drive through the Bryant neighborhood and you blink, you might miss it. It's a tiny neighborhood, 4 blocks by 4 blocks, but we're south of 38th Street and Central is north of 38th Street. So I moved here in 2007, and I moved here very intentionally, looking for a Black community, trying to escape white supremacy in the suburbs. And so I settled here right before the recession hit, and I saw how the 2008 recession really rocked this community, specifically with the further displacement of Black families that pioneered this community. And when I started to really see the gentrification, on my block, that's when I started really getting involved. And, so my organizing, unfortunately, was reactionary. But it didn't take long for us to realize we had to build infrastructure, and we have to be on the offense. We can't be on the defense. We have to learn how to frame it and control the narratives. So part of that was learning about this community and the rich history. We've learned that the Tilson-Built project that began, I believe it was 1954, was the first federally funded, integrated open housing opportunities, and this community quickly became a Black community. So 38th and 4th Avenue was the residential corridor. I'm sorry, East 38th and 4th was the business corridor, but 4th Avenue going up and down Bryant Central was the residential corridor. And so Chicago was the racial boundary. On the east side of Chicago was, racial covenants that made it a very white community historically, and much more of a Black community historically on the west side of Chicago. So Chicago and 38th has always been battled over. That has been a disputed border, just like many borders throughout the world, right? It just doesn't get as much attention because it's a very local issue, but now it's a global issue. So our work really was rooted in combating gentrification. So 2013 is when I really started to get active in organizing in the neighborhood. I had a background in doing some political organizing. In 2008, I worked for the re-election campaign of Congressman Keith Ellison, and we helped, get Obama and all the Democrats elected. And I realized after doing that work that there's not a whole lot of power in political organizing. And so in 2013, I really started neighborhood organizing and doing community organizing. And I realized there's so much more power in the community. And so our work was rooted in combating gentrification and, again, policing in another way, right? So as white folks moved into this community, the community quickly changed and still is changing. And just like any community, when gentrification happens, whether that's wealthier people moving into working class communities, white folks moving into communities of color, or, the development that really, lures tourists or whatever into a community that displaces the historic pioneers of those communities, that you begin to see like policing is a much broader system of how we interact with one another, and the actual police force is just the most violent expression of that and the most violent mechanism of that. But so there's a documentary called The Jim Crow of the North by producer Daniel Bergen, and it's, people can watch it on YouTube, and it's about the city, and specifically there's a segment focusing on this community and how Black folks were segregated, and their only real option was to move here and to buy homes here in South Central, at least on the South Side. So then, a generation later, those same families are being displaced, and the few places they did have refuge where they could build community and own property, that's being taken away, right? So what we saw, and so many communities see this not just communities that are experiencing aggressive gentrification, but for sure communities that are experiencing aggressive gentrification throughout the country and the world, right? You see property crimes, vandalism, and car and garage burglaries, and a typical response in neighborhoods, especially here in Minneapolis, is crime and safety meetings with the police and the council member and the neighborhood association. So some of the work we did was taking back those narratives in those spaces and saying, hey, instead of organizing white homeowners to say, hey, how do we get more police in the community, or how do we create our own policing system of neighborhood watch to protect property, why don't we talk about the root of what's driving these crimes and these conditions? And so we were able to do that going back to 2016 after 3 years of defensive organizing or reactionary organizing. We were finally able to kind of begin to control the narrative, and they were really productive conversations. They were mostly white homeowners who participated, which is not uncommon in a racial capitalist society when people are overworked. Rent is higher than ever, wages are lower than ever, and people have less time to volunteer and participate. But obviously there's never a volunteer shortage of white folks. And we see that even in Black and brown communities. And so I say all that to say that, we work with everybody who shows up, even though, of course, our goal is to center Black and brown voices, specifically Black voices who've pioneered this community. And so folks show up for different reasons and different capacities to our community conversations, but it wasn't as difficult as we thought to make some of these connections and get the so-called gentrifiers of the community to start to understand all of our role in upholding white supremacy, especially white folks who move into a community without understanding the community, the existing community, and the history. So we began to, have conversations about engaging youth and families and building community. And instead of building neighborhood watch or police systems, how do we build community safety in a different capacity through, economic opportunities, through putting resources where the needs are, and through community mediation and conflict resolution. Those are the best tools that we youth workers and teachers have to deal with conflict. And a lot of the most violent conflict that happens in our city is among young people. So having youth workers lead communities rather than police officers, militarized, protectors of the state. So that's how we frame this. And, again, this is really, it's tied to this battle for land. And, we want to drive this home that, what's playing out on 38th in Chicago in 2020 is a 400-year-old struggle for land since Europeans, claimed this land for themselves and settled. And there has never been any real land rights for anybody else, especially Black folks, right? Even indigenous folks and their indigenous land have such very little claim to the land in the United States. And even most white people up until, the New Deal didn't have any real claim to owning property. Historically, the United States, was a system that was rooted in the value of private property over human life. And so when we see, this brother George Floyd get murdered over, a counterfeit $20 bill. Obviously it was much more complex than that, but that's what kicked it off. That's what kicked off the whole interaction, right? It was a business who, is also being made an easy scapegoat. The business, of course, Cup Foods has been problematic in this community, and everybody knows that, but they've also been rooted in this community as well. And, it's the system that says we call the police to deal with every little conflict, rather than the actual person who calls the police. So we try to keep framing this in a broader lens, right? Like the Beckys and the Karens who are popping up on YouTube videos, viral videos everywhere, who are calling the police, making up stories to protect themselves from Black men. They are problematic. They are definitely problematic, and they're in this community. And the Connors and the Kevins too, right? Women always get blamed for it, but really it's men who are at the top of this pyramid. And so Derek Chauvin, when he shows up the way he did on Memorial Day at Cup Foods, he's protecting the Kevins and the Connors and the Beckys and the Karens in this community. He's not doing anything wrong in his mind, and he's not wrong. Betsy Hodges, who I'm not a fan of by any means, wrote an op-ed for the New York Times, and I don't want to argue how genuine her words are, because clearly she was part of the problem and she had the opportunity to make some serious changes, and it's easy for her to Monday morning quarterback. And the words she wrote are very true, and they need to be said, that the police are also an easy scapegoat when they're really just doing the job that the politicians and the corporations and the white liberal gentrifiers ask them to do, right? So when racial covenants fail to keep Black people out of, the east side of Chicago Avenue, right? Then you see lynch mobs like the Arthur Lee family in the early, I think it was 1931, right? They moved to 46 in Columbus, which was, a racially segregated white community. And, the racial covenants did not stop this Black family from moving in. So 4,000 violent white folks showed up on their lawn to force them out. It took them a couple years, but they forced the family out. And again, so in 2020, we're not going to see a violent mob of 4,000 white men try to force a Black family out. They just call the police, right? And they say they were playing their music too loud, or they were smoking weed or something, right? So we want to connect this to this bigger picture, because, if we just have a narrow focus on police abolitionism, I think we're going to lose, because America does not love Black people more than they love the police, right? Like, they have the police for a reason. And America, especially white Americans, especially don't love Black people more than they love their private property, right? So that's the work that needs to be done. How do we help people reconnect to their humanity, all of us? Because racism has done a number on all of us, where we value private property over human life. So connecting people back to their humanity is rooted in abolishing racial capitalism, right? This whole arrangement where we need the police. If we don't begin to address that, we're just going to recreate a new system and call it something different, right? The origins of the US experiment are rooted in enterprise and profit, right? It's rooted in extracting wealth from Black and brown and indigenous bodies, first and foremost, as well as the land, and redistributing that wealth to white people and white communities. That has been the arrangement this whole time for 400 years. And so when, the conservatives, the fascists want to always talk about communism or socialism and the redistribution of wealth and resources to scare people, what they fail to mention is that the redistribution of wealth has always been happening. Socialism for the elite, for the few white males who can own property historically in this country, including human property, right, have always had a system. It's been a Ponzi scheme of extracting wealth from us to prop up this system of white supremacy and racial capitalism. And now, the wealthiest country in the history of the world. That's a long answer, isn't it?
No, I appreciate that answer, and I appreciate the thoughtfulness and intention there. There's a protest saying the whole damn system is guilty as hell, and I think and is broken as hell, and I think that's a false statement. The system is not broken. The system is actually, these systems of oppression, these systems of white supremacy are actually operating in the exact same way that they're supposed to be operating. They are not broken by any means. This is what they're supposed to be doing. And I wonder, as you look, and as a follow-up to that, as people talk about police abolition, what I'm seeing a lot of is this recreation of these same systems of oppression. So for example, wanting to put money into healthcare systems to respond to issues that normally people call the police for, and not realizing how often healthcare is used to actually prop up those same systems of oppression that police are called for. So as you look at the organizing that's happening now, what are your perspectives on what that work looks like, and whether or not it's actually going to make viable change in the community, or at least reform in the community? And I say reform with a quote unquote, because reform is not what we need. But if people are looking for reform, do you think the way that they're going about it is valid?
No, I don't. I think we have to be able to read through the interference. There's too many open questions. So I think, defund the police, when I hear that, that's a different movement than abolition. Folks for years have been calling to defund and divest from policing and move those funds into community resources, so we can center community care, right? And unfortunately, the way things are structured is, we can't necessarily do both, right? We can't tie up $200 million a year for policing and provide all the resources our communities need. So we got to understand the different conversations that are happening. And, when we talk about reform, again, right now, we're beginning to see such a divide within Black communities, and you have gatekeepers of white supremacy, of racial capitalism, who are going to use exploited people, Black people, Latino people, immigrants, queer folks, trans folks, to save racial capitalism, right? They're going to find people who agree with them. They're going to give them the biggest platform they've ever had in their life. And, so for example, you got Northside Lisa Clemens, who was a former police officer, who, people are saying she represents a very mainstream, Black perspective, and she doesn't. She just has a louder platform. Again, when you start to actually really listen to Black folks, our hopes and our dreams have nothing to do with the police, right? When Black folks dream about their future, it is a future free of racial terrorism. Like Reverend Al Sharpton said, we need white folks to get their knee off our neck so we can grow and we can be who we need to be, not who y'all want us to be. And so I say all that to say that, again, there is no consensus, within the Black community. I don't know if there ever has been, outside of the idea that, we all want to be free. Of course, freedom looks different depending on who you ask. And let us not forget that many people profit from these systems, including Black folks, right? Whether we're talking about policing or prisons or military or war. And we have to be able to have honest conversations, and we have to have honest media that is investigating that and interrogating that, and being able to call that out and make those obvious connections, right? Of course, they're going to save a system that they profit from. So can you repeat the question again? I'm sorry.
No worries. Just as you look at the work that's happening around the organizing right now, what's your vision, and does any of the organizing that's happening right now seem viable to you? And what feels like valid abolition work to you?
Right. Okay. So, as we talk to neighbors and community members, one of the first things that we hear is neighborhood watch. Let's recreate neighborhood watch programs. Those were effective. A lot of people, I think, are traumatized from the 90s, where we had a lot of high gang activity, and crack cocaine, was obviously a criminal problem back then rather than a health problem, or economic problem, the way obviously it was framed by the mainstream Democrats and Republicans. And, again, neighborhood watch isn't inherently bad. You could use a neighborhood watch system and do some deep anti-racist work, or you can just recreate a racist policing system. So other ideas I've heard, new ideas that I think are worth really investing more in, are community chaplains, right? Like spiritual advisors who are non-denominational and don't have a religious focus, but who can mediate, domestic issues in our communities. I forget where I heard this data, but the 5th precinct that serves the South Central community where I live, I believe it was 85 to 90% of all calls received in, I think it was 2018, were nonviolent and needed a nonviolent response. But yet our system is so unsophisticated. All we have is militarized responders who are very expensive as well, right? So, the idea of chaplains was, what if, we collected the data of domestic calls and we started to build community programs that employed chaplains. And the Bryant neighborhood where I live, it's a historic Black community. It was up to, I think, 70% Black around 1990, the census. And also we know, Black folks are historically undercounted. But there's also a lot of small Black family churches here. I refer to it sometimes as the Black Bible Belt of South Minneapolis. And it's a very spiritual community. I don't say that disparaging. I say that in a way that there's a lot of power in this community, or at least there was, right? And it's still visible. And, Black folks in this community listen to spiritual leaders, right? More than they're going to listen to politicians, or for sure more than they're going to listen to a weaponized state authority like the Minneapolis police officer. So again, as we begin to really examine the function of policing in our society, we realize we've outsourced safety to people that, in many ways are the enemy of Black people and Black communities, right? Growing up in the suburbs, I grew up, I literally, had to fist fight white racist kids in my neighborhood. And, we're seeing a lot of these, people are the prototype of our urban police officers. So not only did we outsource safety, but we outsourced it to the enemies of Black people. Isn't that something? And so again, this is tied to a bigger conversation of how racial capitalism, it incentivizes us to create more convenient lifestyles where we outsource everything, right? Including jobs, right? So, it's ridiculous. And we have to reclaim community and it's rooted in reconnecting to humanity, and it's rooted in really having conversations, right? Like, you know, there's that old cliche that, oh, I'm not racist, I got a black friend, right? And we know that's usually weaponized by racist people to say really racist stuff, right? I don't know if I could curse on here, but I was about to. But there's also a lot of truth in that, right? You're gonna be less racist when your next door neighbors, you know, are among family that you break bread with regularly, right? Or, you know, a black and a white family live next door to each other, and their kids grow up playing together, and the parents build relationships around that, right? You are going to be less racist when you realize at the end of the day, like, we all have such simple, common connections and dreams. Like, we all want healthy and safe communities. We all want healthy children and, you know, vibrant cities to live in. Nobody wants to live in squalor. Nobody wants to live in poverty. Nobody wants to live under threats of violence. The problem is only certain people have had to endure those conditions, while, you know, the masses, specifically white, middle class, and upper class people, have been protected from that. And that arrangement is by design. That's what we got to get people to understand. It's cause and effect, and they work together.
So we've talked a little bit about the organizing, or more than a little bit about the organizing happening right now, but specific to the city council's work to change the city charter so that they have more control over MPD. Do you think that that work has any room within this abolition vision that you have presented?
Absolutely. I do think the charter needs to be changed, that's for sure. I also think people put too much stake in systematic change and not enough resources and, you know, our outside game. You know, it was when people took over the streets is when, you know, the leaders even remotely started talking about justice and change. So changing the charter is definitely important. And what people are confused about, you know, I literally just had this conversation yesterday in my block meeting. And, you know, people think changing the charter means putting defund the police or abolish the police in the charter. But no, changing the charter, it just means right now the way the charter is written is the city mandates X amount of police for X amount of residents. I don't know the formula, but there's a formula. And although the policing is an antiquated system that is deeply tied to slavery and an expensive system, it is mandated by our charter that we pay for these services, right? So that needs to change. So amending the charter just means we have to change the structure that says you have to pay for this very expensive system that terrorizes Black people and does a lot of bad things to many communities. So organizing around that is, you know, so here in the Bryant and Central community, we've been hosting Saturday community assemblies at Phelps Park in response to the murder of George Floyd. And we've been very upfront with our neighbors. Our meetings are not to build safety plans around protecting private property. Our meetings are rooted in justice and listening to Black folks. And that's the only way to build true safety and security in this community, is by building safety for everybody, especially those who are the least among us. So not just Black folks, but poor Black folks, right? So we have community assemblies every Saturday at Phelps Park. And then we're asking people to take these conversations to their blocks. So we're having midweek block meetings and then weekend community-wide meetings. And, so we've been having panels and speakers on Saturday, and a lot of, these conversations, there's a lot that we're talking about. It's all interconnected, and we're trying to help people make the connections, but we don't necessarily process it all on that Saturday in a big community. So we ask people to do some unpacking within their block. So last night within my block meeting, we talked about the charter, the defund movement, and I don't try to speak as an authority to my neighbors. I collect questions and I bring them back to the folks. So we're working on a panel to talk about these specific issues in the next 2 to 3 weeks at Phelps Park. So our neighborhood organizing work, again, the Bryant and Central neighborhood organizations, I don't believe they have officially or formally endorsed abolition like the city council has done. And I think neighborhood organizations should consider doing that. I'm not on the board of directors anymore. I stepped off the board last fall, but I'm a leader in the community, and they pay me as a consultant to help do some of this organizing work as they build their own staff and organization. But I say all that to say that I think neighborhood organizations are a powerful and underutilized system that has been overutilized by white homeowners and gentrifiers, and underutilized by renters, Black and brown folks, and folks who believe in anti-racist organizing. And so I think using our model of taking over neighborhood organizations, developing leaders in this community, especially Black and brown leaders, but also white leaders as well, because this is white people's duty to dismantle racism because they created it, right? And so I think it would be a helpful movement to have neighborhoods go behind and pass their own resolution similar to the city council to abolish the police. And I don't think that that needs to be our major focus either. I think really building community around how do we recenter connectedness. And I think naturally what comes from those conversations are safety and community engagement. And so our goal is to move these from conversations into working groups. And along the process, we're going to train people. We use the People's Institute Undoing Racism training as a model. One of my colleagues in this community is Sandra Richardson. She's born and raised here in the Bryant neighborhood, and she runs the People's Institute North. And so our goal is to build or establish a permanent anti-racist training center where we can train the community for free. People don't have to pay. And we could train them not only how to, have an anti-racist analysis, but how to put it into practice, into community organizing, into dismantling and disrupting oppressive systems, beginning with an economic lens, and how do we put resources where the need is. So one other example I quickly want to lift up is, after the killing of George Floyd on Memorial Day, so much has happened in terms of organizing, and so much has happened organically. Like, the community came together, to create the memorial. Folks in the community there's 2 mutual aid centers where families can get groceries at: the Phelps Boys and Girls Club, Southside Village on 39th in Chicago, as well as CTUL, CTUL on 37th in Chicago, both a block from the memorial site on the south and north side. And, there's on certain days of the week, walking to the memorial, you could get breakfast or lunch. People built a makeshift cemetery to say their names Memorial Cemetery, which is very powerful, on 37th and Columbus. So just tucked around the corner from the memorial. Community safety patrols, to do what the police have always failed to do. There's a medic station at the memorial. So like that sort of community response that happened organically gives me so much hope. And the neighborhood organizations, what I'm pushing them to do is to build infrastructure around that. Why isn't our city council, putting all their time and energy into building infrastructure around the new community that has been created, right? Because if you listen to Black folks here in the Bryan Central neighborhood, that's the most common thing we hear is people are grieving from a loss of community, right? Where, they felt home rather than alienated in their historical neighborhood. And so we have a model to lift up, right? Our council member Jenkins has been really pushing to reopen the intersection of 38th and Chicago, which is really, it's a fight that this community doesn't need right now. We're literally weeks into the grieving process. And, we've seen streets shut down for years due to road construction. Why can't this intersection stay shut while people grieve and we figure out long-term solutions? And so the narrative that city elected officials are painting around how the closure of the street and the memorial creates danger is a false narrative, and we're challenging that, right? So a lot of the work we've been doing, again, we're on the defense constantly trying to frame and control and battle narratives, right? Because these same politicians didn't paint this neighborhood as dangerous when Derek Chauvin killed George Floyd, because it's only really dangerous to people that look like me, right? My white neighbors don't have to shop on 38th in Chicago, worry about getting a knee to their neck. And nobody would have been showing up to our community assemblies had the streets not been destroyed, right? And people acknowledge that, and people in our community, our neighbors, they're very apologetic, and they acknowledge that, it's problematic that it took all of this to happen to get us to show up. And again, we don't push people away. We say, we want to pull people in. We say, you know what? You're here. We're going to work with you. It's not too late.
And just for a minute before I let you go, since we're well over the half an hour time limit we would set, if you want to talk about your podcast and your column real quick, and then we can let people know just about your column at the UpTake.
Yes. So I started People Power Podcasts. Right now it's available on YouTube. I started it as a response to the pandemic. And, really the conditions this year have created the perfect oppressive cocktail with the global pandemic and depression, economic depression, as well as, the racial terrorism. So unemployed people have time to protest, right? So my podcast has it started out very experimental, and I think I've found kind of my traction in covering the people's updates as well as coronavirus updates. And the overall goal with the podcast is to report on people power that the mainstream media misses: protests, direct actions, community, bring the voices of community organizers, neighbors, who are often left out of these conversations, but who have been really leading a lot of this work on the ground. And so I'm wrapping up season 1. It started out as kind of trying to do a daily podcast, which is way too much work. So I'm trying to sustain it to 2 episodes a week, and I'm wrapping up season 1, and I'm gonna start raising funds to work on season 2. So I'm gonna take a few weeks off. I've been pausing a few weeks just with everything that's going on. There's a lot of work to do. So I'm gonna I'll have a few more episodes to wrap up season 1. We'll take a few weeks off, come back with season 2, and try to get it up on all podcast platforms for people. And so I've been doing some on and off writing for our community newspaper. We have a dual language newspaper that's delivered to every home in the Bryant Central neighborhood called Voces de South Central in English and Spanish. And I'm also excited now to be a part of the UpTake team and keep reporting on the ongoing battle on East 38th in Chicago, as well as the citywide battle, because all of these systems work together to create the oppressive conditions that we see in Minneapolis, right? We didn't become the worst city and the worst state in the nation for Black folks on accident. It takes all these systems to work together to create this sort of inequality, and it takes brave media to report on it and to bring those voices. So I'm excited about this partnership.
And we're excited to have you, and very excited for this conversation and grateful for the opportunity to have had it. Really excited for this series. We'll be talking about MPD 150, talking about the city charter in future episodes, just wanting to explore this conversation from all angles and really do it by centering Black voices and centering discussions around equity and what equity truly looks like in the community in these discussions. As with all things, thank you so much. We're grateful to have your time. I'm going to end the video because I'm not quite sure how to take this down from being live, and I will speak with you all later.
And I just want to give one last shout out to MPD 150. They have a new updated version of their report coming out soon. So look for that real soon. Thank you, Serene.
Thank you so much.